There was a truck in my driveway at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. I know this because my neighbour Paulette saw it. Paulette is 71 years old, and she has lived next door to me on Birchwood Lane for 19 years, and she is, without question, the most attentive observer of residential activity on our street. She knows when the mail runs late. She knows whose grandchildren are visiting, and whose hydrangeas are struggling, and whose husband's truck has been replaced by a car she hasn't seen before. Paulette notices things. I have, at various points over 19 years, found this quality mildly amusing and occasionally useful, and once, briefly, a little much. I will be grateful for it for the rest of my life. Paulette saw the truck at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in September. A large truck. Not a moving company truck. Not the kind with a logo and a phone number on the side. Not the kind that announces its purpose in the legible professional way of a legitimate operation. A rented truck. The kind you get from a hardware store parking lot when you need to move something large and do not want the expense or the paper trail of a professional service. She saw two men carry my husband's armchair out of my front door and load it into the truck. She saw them carry his workbench from the garage. She saw them carry 4 boxes that she could not identify from her kitchen window, but that she watched long enough to understand were not being carried out by people who lived in my house. She called me. I was at the cemetery. I was standing at my husband Walter's grave on the day of his graveside service, or in the specific suspended unreality of a woman who has just watched her husband of 34 years lowered into the ground and who is not yet sure how the world expects her to continue existing in his absence. And my phone rang and I looked at the screen and it said Paulette, and I almost did not answer because I was at my husband's grave, and whatever Paulette needed could wait. I answered. "Loretta," she said, "there are men at your house." I looked at the grave. I looked at the phone. "What men?" I said. "I don't know," she said. "But they have a truck, and they have been going in and out of your front door for 40 minutes, and I don't think you know they're there." I knew who they were before I got in my car. I knew because there was only one set of people in the world who had a spare key to my house and who would use it on the day of my husband's funeral while I was standing at his grave. His family. My name is Loretta, and I am going to tell you what I came home to. I am not going to be gentle about it. I have been gentle about it for too long already. In the legal consultations and the police reports and the family mediations that went nowhere, and the conversations where I was advised, by people who meant well, to consider the optics, to think about what Walter would have wanted, to remember that grief makes people do things they would not otherwise do. I have been patient with every version of that advice. I am done being patient. What Walter's family did on the day of his funeral was not grief. It was preparation. And the difference between those two things is the entire story. Before I go any further, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your city, your state, your country, in the comments right now. Tell me what time it is where you are. I want to know who is in this room with me because this story is going to make you feel something, and I want to know where in the world that feeling is landing. And I have a question for you before we start. Have you ever had someone take something from you and then explain to you why it was theirs? Leave your answer below, because that is what this story is about. And if you are not subscribed, do it now, because Loretta has been quiet long enough, and she is done. Let me tell you about Walter first, because you cannot understand what was taken from me, not just the furniture, not just the objects, but the full weight of what that truck represented, without understanding the man whose name was on the deed of that house, and what he meant to me, and what his family had always believed his meaning to them, superseded. Walter James Odom was 67 years old when he died. Prostate cancer. Diagnosed 14 months before his death, managed with the specific exhausting combination of treatment and hope, and the daily recalibration of a man who is trying to stay present in his own life while also preparing for its end. He was not a man who complained. And I want to be precise about that because it is relevant to who he was and because the absence of complaint in a man facing what Walter was facing is not stoicism for its own sake, but something more considered. The choice of a person who has decided that the time he has left is too valuable to spend cataloguing what is wrong with it. He spent 14 months being present. With me. With our daughter Simone, who is 31 and who lives 40 minutes away and who came every weekend without being asked from the diagnosis to the end. With his garden, which he tended with the focused attention of a man who understood that the tomatoes were not going to wait for his convenience. With his woodworking, which had been his practice for 20 years and which produced, in those last 14 months, a rocking chair he made for Simone's front porch and a small cabinet he made for our bedroom and a jewellery box he made for me that I want you to know I have moved to the centre of my dresser and that I look at every morning. He was present, and then he was gone. And 3 hours after I stood at his grave, his brother Dennis and his nephew Corey showed up at my house with a rented truck. I need to tell you about Dennis. Dennis Odom is 63 years old, Walter's younger brother by 4 years. He lives 20 minutes from Birchwood Lane, in a house that Walter helped him buy. And I mean that literally. Walter co-signed the mortgage in 2009 when Dennis's credit was not sufficient to qualify on his own, and Dennis has lived there for 15 years, and that co-sign has never once been mentioned as the favour it was. Dennis worked in logistics for most of his career and retired early on a pension that is comfortable enough, and he has, for as long as I have known him, operated with the specific entitlement of a man who believes that proximity to someone more capable than himself constitutes a claim on that person's resources. He loved Walter. I believe that genuinely. Whatever Dennis did on that Tuesday in September, I do not think it came from an absence of love for his brother. I think it came from something more complicated and more corrosive than the absence of love. From a version of love that had always been tangled up with ownership, with the belief that Walter belonged to his family of origin in a way that superseded the family Walter had chosen and built. That belief did not begin with Walter's death. It had been there from the beginning. I met Walter in 1989. I was 28 years old, working as an office manager for a medical practice in Birmingham, Alabama, where I had lived my whole life. Walter was 33, working construction management, recently relocated from Tuscaloosa, where he had grown up and where his family still was, and where they had, I would discover over the following years, a very clear idea of who Walter Odom was supposed to be and what his life was supposed to look like. That idea did not include me. Not immediately. Not obviously. There was no confrontation at the first dinner, no direct statement of objection, nothing that Walter could have pointed to and said, "There it is." It was subtler than that, and in some ways harder to address because of the subtlety. It was the specific, our ambient coolness of people who are performing welcome while withholding it. The way Walter's mother, Miss Ida, always called me honey in a tone that managed to make the endearment feel like a category rather than a name. The way Dennis referred to Walter's previous girlfriend, a woman named Patricia whom Walter had dated for 2 years before I came along. In the first 5 years of our marriage with a frequency and a warmth that was clearly not accidental. Patricia, who was from Tuscaloosa, who was, in the unspoken geography of Walter's family, the right kind of person for Walter to have ended up with. I was not from Tuscaloosa. I want to be clear about what I am, and am not saying here. I am not saying Walter's family was openly hostile. I'm not saying they were cruel, or that they made our lives difficult in ways that rose to the level of incident. What I am saying is that for 34 years, I sat at holiday tables and family dinners and birthday celebrations with people who had decided before they knew me that I was not quite right for Walter, and who had maintained that position so consistently and so quietly that it had become simply the texture of things, the background weather of a marriage that was otherwise full and good and entirely worth the weather. Walter knew. We talked about it, not constantly, not with the exhausting regularity of people who cannot leave a wound alone, but clearly and honestly when it needed to be talked about. He acknowledged what I experienced, or he did not dismiss it or minimize it or perform the particular blindness of a person who finds it more comfortable not to see what his family is doing. He saw it. He named it. He told his mother once, firmly and without ambiguity, that I was his wife, and that his home was my home, and that he needed her to treat it that way. She said, "Of course, honey," and went back to calling me honey. I loved Walter for trying. I did not expect the trying to fully work. The children question made it worse. Walter and I had Simone in 1993, one child, which was our choice. A choice made with full information and full agreement, and that I have never regretted for a single day of my life. Dennis had 3 children. Walter's sister Gwen, who lives in Atlanta and who is a quieter presence in this story, but not an innocent one, had 2. The Odom family ran on children, on the specific currency of grandchildren and cousins, and the accumulation of the next generation as evidence of a family's vitality and continuation. One child was, in Miss Ida's unspoken accounting, insufficient. Simone was loved. I want to be clear about that. Whatever the family's feelings about me, Simone was an Odom, and she was loved as an Odom, and she spent summers in Tuscaloosa and holidays with cousins, and had the full texture of an extended family that I had not had growing up, and that I was genuinely glad she had. I was not going to deprive my daughter of her grandmother and her cousins because her grandmother called me honey in the wrong tone. But I noticed. I always noticed. And I filed it away in the particular filing system of a woman who understands that the things people reveal about themselves in small moments are the truest data points she has, and that the data, accumulated over years, tells a story she should not ignore. The data told me this. Walter's family, Dennis specifically, but also Gwen and to a lesser extent some of the cousins, had always believed that Walter's assets, Walter's house, Walter's accumulated 34 years of a life he had built with me, were in some fundamental sense family assets. That the Odom family had a claim on Walter that predated me, and that survived me, and that would, when the time came, take precedence over whatever arrangements Walter and I had made between ourselves. They had just been waiting for the time to come. The time came on a Tuesday in September. I need to tell you about the house. Walter and I bought the house on Birchwood Lane in 1997, a 3-bedroom craftsman with a porch that Walter spent 2 summers restoring and a backyard that became, over 27 years, the garden that he tended and the workshop where he built things, and the place where Simone learned to ride a bike, and where we ate dinner outside on summer evenings, and where I can still, if I stand at the kitchen window at the right time of day, see Walter in the specific quality of the afternoon light in a way that I am not going to describe further, because it is mine and I am keeping it. The house was in both our names. I want you to hold on to that. Both names. Mine and Walter's. On the deed. On the mortgage we paid off in 2019. On every document that described the ownership of that property. Both names. Then Walter's family knew this. It did not stop them. Dennis had a spare key. Walter had given it to him years earlier, 2015, when we were traveling for 3 weeks and needed someone to water the garden and collect the mail. A practical arrangement. The kind of thing you do with family without thinking too carefully about what you are also doing, which is extending trust into a space that has not yet been tested. The key was never returned. We never asked for it back. I have thought about that. I have thought about a great many things in the year since the Tuesday in September, and the key is one of them. The small, ordinary, completely reasonable decision to give a spare key to a family member, and the way that decision was sitting in Dennis Odom's possession for 9 years, waiting for the right Tuesday. He knew I would be at the cemetery. Of course he knew. He had been at the funeral service that morning. He had stood at the graveside. He had hugged me. And then he had driven to a hardware store parking lot and rented a truck. Paulette was standing on her porch when I pulled into the driveway. Not pretending to do something else, not watering plants or checking the mail with the studied casualness of a neighbour who happens to be outside. Just standing there, arms crossed, with the expression of a woman who has been watching something happen that she could not stop and who has been waiting, with the specific helpless vigilance of a person who loves you, for you to come home. She walked over before I got out of the car. "They're gone," she said. "Left about 20 minutes ago." I looked at my front door. It was closed. That detail has stayed with me. The closed door. As though closing it on the way out was the final courtesy of people who had just spent 2 hours walking through my house, taking what they wanted. As though the closed door was evidence of some residual sense of propriety, some acknowledgement that they were aware, on some level, of what the open door would have looked like to a woman coming home from her husband's grave. They closed the door. They took his armchair and closed the door. "How many of them?" I said. "2, Paulette said. I didn't recognize them. An older man and a younger one. Dennis and Corey. Dennis is 63. Corey is his son, 38, who has his father's specific quality of orbiting a more forceful personality and absorbing its certainties as his own. Corey had always deferred to Dennis the way Dennis had always deferred to Walter, with the complete conviction of a man who believes that the person above him in the family hierarchy is simply right, and that being right by association is a reasonable substitute for developing your own judgment. I thanked Paulette. I walked to my front door. I want to tell you what it is like to open the door of your own house and understand, before you have fully crossed the threshold, that it is different inside, not empty. They had not taken everything. This was not a complete stripping of a home. There was furniture remaining and dishes in the cabinets and photographs on the walls. But different in the specific atmospheric way that a space is different when something significant has been removed from it. The way a room with a missing painting still shows you where the painting was. The way absence has a shape. I stood in the doorway, and I looked at the shape of what was gone. The armchair was the first thing I saw. Or rather, I saw the place where it had been, in the corner of the living room beside the window where Walter had sat every evening for 27 years. A specific corner. The corner where the afternoon light came in at the angle he liked, and where he kept his reading glasses on the side table, and where I had brought him his coffee every morning since his diagnosis, because the walk from the bedroom to the kitchen had become, in the last months, more than he wanted to manage first thing. The side table was still there. The armchair was not. I stood in that doorway and I looked at the side table sitting beside an empty corner, and I felt something I am going to try to describe accurately, because accuracy is what I promised you, and I am going to keep that promise, even when the accurate thing is not the composed thing. I felt like I had been robbed at the grave, not before the funeral, not while Walter was still alive, not in the weeks of his dying when I might have had the capacity to fight it. At the grave. At the specific, unrepeatable moment of a woman's maximum vulnerability, when the ground is still open and the flowers are still fresh, and the grief is so new it does not yet have a shape. That is when they came. That is when Dennis Odom decided the time was right. I walked further into the house. The living room had the armchair missing and the side table abandoned, and a gap on the bookshelf where Walter's collection of woodworking books had been. 12 volumes, some of them 40 years old. The accumulated reference library of a man who had taught himself a craft from scratch and who had kept every book that taught him something. Gone. The woodworking books. I stood at that gap in the bookshelf, and I thought about Walter at 30 years old buying his first book on joinery from a hardware store and teaching himself to cut a dovetail joint at the kitchen table with a piece of scrap wood and the focused, absorbed expression of a person discovering something they are going to love for the rest of their life. Dennis took the books. I moved to the garage. The workbench was gone. Walter had built that workbench himself in 2003, and built it from reclaimed lumber he had sourced over 3 months from a demolition site, planned and joined and finished with the specific attention of a man building something he intended to use for a very long time. It was 8 feet long and solid enough that we had once, during a particularly ambitious Thanksgiving, used it as an overflow table. It had Walter's measurements penciled on the side in his handwriting. The marks of a man who used his bench as a record as well as a surface, who wrote down what he was working on and how it was going because the writing was part of the process. His handwriting. In pencil on the side of the bench he built. Gone. The tool chest was gone too. Not the small tool chest he kept in the kitchen for household repairs. That was still there. And I have thought about the calculation behind that. The decision about which tools to take and which to leave. The specific editorial process of 2 men moving through a dead man's workshop deciding what was worth loading. The large tool chest. The one with 4 drawers and a lock, and the set of hand planes Walter had accumulated over 20 years, each one tuned and maintained with a care that most people reserve for objects considerably more expensive than hand planes. The hand planes were gone. I stood in the garage for a long time. I want to tell you about the watch. Walter had one significant piece of jewellery. A watch, a 1974 Omega Seamaster that had belonged to his father, who had received it as a gift from his own employer upon 30 years of service, and who had given it to Walter when Walter turned 30 because Walter was the eldest son. And that was, in the Odom family, the logic of inheritance. Walter wore it on Sundays and special occasions and kept it in a small wooden dish on his dresser the rest of the time. He had worn it the day of his diagnosis. He had worn it the day we married. He had worn it at Simone's college graduation, and at every Christmas and at the dinner we had on our 30th anniversary at the restaurant we had gone to on our first date. I went to the bedroom. The small wooden dish on his dresser was empty. I sat on the edge of the bed. I want to be honest about what happened next because I said raw and unfiltered and I meant it, and the accurate thing is this. I sat on the edge of the bed in the bedroom of the house I had shared with Walter for 27 years. In the dress I had worn to his funeral, and I was so angry that the grief stepped back for a moment. Not gone. The grief was not gone. The grief was going to be there for a very long time. It was going to be there after the legal fight and after the resolution and after every chapter of what came next. But in that specific moment on the edge of that bed, the anger was larger than the grief, and I sat inside it and I let it be as large as it needed to be. Because the anger was appropriate, because what Dennis and Corey had done was not a misunderstanding or a grief-addled error in judgment or a family disagreement about the disposition of shared belongings. It was a calculated, pre-planned act executed at the moment of maximum vulnerability and minimum resistance. And I was going to be as angry about it as I needed to be, and I was not going to let anyone, not Dennis, not the police officer I had not yet called, not the well-meaning friends who would soon be advising me to consider the optics. I was not going to let anyone manage me out of the anger I had earned. I called Simone. She answered on the first ring. She had left the cemetery before me. She had her own drive home, her own grief to carry. And I had told her to go, that I would call her later, that she did not need to come back to the house with me. I had said this because in the suspended unreality of the graveside, I had still believed that later meant a cup of tea and a quiet house, and the beginning of the long work of figuring out how to exist without Walter. I had not known about the truck yet. "Mama," she said. "Simone," I said, "I need you to come." She heard something in my voice. "I'm already getting my keys," she said. I told her what Paulette had seen. I told her about the armchair and the workbench and the woodworking books and the hand planes and the watch. I heard the specific quality of her silence. Not the silence of a person who has nothing to say, but the silence of a woman who has known her father's family for 31 years and who is, in that moment, understanding something she had suspected for a long time. "Uncle Dennis?" she said. Not a question. "Yes," I said. "Mama," she said. and her voice had the specific, controlled fury of a 31-year-old woman who loves her mother and has just been given permission to feel what she has been feeling about this family for years. "Mama, I am going to need you to call the police before I get there." "Why before you get there?" I said, a pause. "Because I would like there to be an official record before I say anything to anybody," she said. I almost smiled. She is her father's daughter, focused, clear. The kind of person who understands that the immediate response matters and who disciplines the immediate response accordingly. I called the police, and then I walked back to the living room and I sat in the chair that was not Walter's chair, and I looked at the corner where his chair had been, and I waited for whatever came next. It was going to be a long fight. I knew that before the officer arrived. I knew it in the same way I had known. Just standing at the mailbox with the phone at my ear while Paulette told me about the truck, I knew it in the way of a woman who has been paying attention to a family for 34 years and who has accumulated enough data to understand that the people who sent a truck to her house on the day of her husband's funeral were not going to hand things back because she asked nicely. I was not going to ask nicely. I was not going to ask at all. I was going to take. The officer's name was Rodriguez. Young, 25, maybe 26, with the careful professional manner of someone still calibrating the distance between the academy and the street, still figuring out which situations require which version of the training. He arrived 40 minutes after I called, which I noted, and he walked through the front door with his notepad out, and his eyes moving through the room the way officers' eyes move, cataloguing, assessing, looking for the shape of the situation before anyone explains it to him. I explained it to him. I told him about the funeral, about Paulette's call, about the truck and the 2 men and the 40 minutes of coming and going through my front door while I was standing at my husband's grave. I told him about the armchair and the workbench and the woodworking books and the hand planes and the watch. I told him that the men had a spare key that my husband had given his brother in 2015 and that, to my knowledge, had never been returned. Rodriguez listened. He wrote things down. He asked the right questions in the right order. When did you leave? When did you return? Can you confirm what was present before you left? Do you have documentation of ownership for the items described? He was thorough and he was respectful, and when I finished, he looked at his notepad for a moment, and then he looked at me and he said, the thing I had known he was going to say before he said it. "Mom," he said, "I have to be honest with you about what I'm looking at here." "Go ahead," I said. "The individuals who entered the property used a key," he said, "which means there's no forced entry. And the items that were removed, without documentation establishing your sole ownership, in the context of a family situation where there may be disputed claims to certain belongings." He paused. "This is likely going to be treated as a civil matter." Civil matter. 2 words. And I had prepared myself for those 2 words on the drive home from the cemetery, in the 40 minutes between Paulette's call and my arrival, in the specific grim way that a woman who has been paying attention prepares herself for the thing she already knows is coming. I had prepared myself, and I was still sitting in my living room across from Officer Rodriguez with Walter's empty armchair corner in my peripheral vision, furious at those 2 words in a way that preparation had not fully blunted. Because civil matter means, we are not going to help you. Civil matter means the legal mechanism that exists to address what happened to you is not the mechanism that I represent. And the mechanism I represent is not going to be deployed on your behalf today, regardless of what was taken, or when it was taken, or the specific, incalculated cruelty of the timing of the taking. Civil matter means good luck. "I understand," I said, and then I said, "I need you to write down everything I've told you. Every item. Every detail. I need this documented even if you can't act on it today." Rodriguez looked at me. "Of course," he said. He wrote it all down. Every item. The armchair, dimensions, and description. The workbench, dimensions and description, and the specific detail about Walter's penciled measurements on the side, the woodworking books, 12 volumes, titles listed to the extent I could remember them, the hand planes, 7 of them, manufacturer and approximate value. The watch, 1974 Omega Seamaster, Walter's father's watch, approximate value and the specific personal significance I described in enough detail that Rodriguez looked up from his notepad twice. He filed the report. He handed me a copy. He told me to contact an attorney. I thanked him and I walked him to the door and I watched him drive away, and then I went back inside and I sat down and I called Dennis. He answered on the second ring. I want to tell you about that phone call because I think it is important. Not just what Dennis said, but how he said it. The specific quality of a man who has done something and who has had, in the hours since doing it, enough time to construct the justification and to arrive at the phone call with the justification fully formed and ready to deploy. He was not defensive. That is the thing I had not anticipated. I had braced myself for defensiveness, for the stumbling guilty register of a man who knows he has done something wrong and is trying to talk his way out of it. What I got, instead, was the composed, almost reasonable tone of a man who had decided that what he had done was not just justifiable, but correct, who had arrived at a position and was prepared to explain it to me as though I were a person who, given the right framing, would understand. Loretta, he said, I know this is a difficult day. Not any of the things a person says when they understand that they have wounded someone. Just my name. In the tone of a man beginning a conversation he has already won in his own head. Dennis, I said, I need you to tell me why you were in my house today. A pause. Brief. The pause of a man organizing his prepared remarks. Those things belong to the family, he said. Walter's tools, his books, his father's watch, those are Odom things. They were Odom before Walter, and they should stay Odom. I sat with that for a moment. Odom things. I had been married to an Odom for 34 years. I had taken his name. I had built a life with him and a home with him and raised his daughter with him and sat with him through 14 months of cancer with his name on my lips and his hand in mine, and I was not, apparently, sufficiently Odom for those things to belong to me. Dennis, I said, my name is on the deed of that house. The house isn't what I took, he said. The things in the house are, I said. The things in my house, the house with my name on the deed. Walter would have wanted the family to have those things, he said. And there it was. The argument I had known was coming since the drive home from the cemetery. The argument that is impossible to disprove and that is deployed precisely because it is impossible to disprove. The invocation of a dead man's wishes as cover for the living person's actions. Walter would have wanted. Walter would have said. Walter, who is in the ground and cannot be asked, who cannot confirm or deny, who cannot look his brother in the eye and say, Dennis, you went to my wife's house on the day of my funeral, and you took my tools and my father's watch, and I need you to understand what you have done. Walter cannot say that. So Dennis says Walter would have wanted instead. Walter had a will, I said. A pause, slightly longer this time. I know he had a will, Dennis said. Then you know what Walter wanted, I said, because he wrote it down, deliberately, with an attorney. But specifically so that there would be no question about what he wanted. Another pause. Some things aren't in a will, Dennis said. The watch is, I said. Silence. I knew the watch was in the will because I had been present when Walter dictated it, and because Walter, who was organized in the way of a man who understood that the people he loved were going to have to deal with the aftermath of his death, had been specific. The watch to Simone, the tools to remain in the family home for Loretta's use or disposition, the workbench, the books, the armchair, all of it addressed. Walter had thought about his things. He had thought about who should have them, and he had written it down, and he had signed it. Dennis had been in Walter's life for 63 years. He knew Walter kept a will. He went anyway. The will can be contested, Dennis said. And there it was again. The second thing I had known was coming. The escalation from Walter would have wanted to the will can be contested, from sentiment to threat, in the space of a single phone call, with Walter not yet 24 hours in the ground. I looked at the empty corner where the armchair had been. Dennis, I said, I am going to give you one opportunity to bring those things back. Everything that was removed from this house today, the armchair, the workbench, the books, the tools, the watch, all of it, back in my house within 48 hours. Loretta? If those things are not back in this house within 48 hours, I said, I am going to pursue every legal option available to me. I am going to pursue them completely and without mercy, and I am going to make sure that whatever it costs you, in time and money, and in the specific public record of what you did on the day of your brother's funeral, I am going to make sure it costs you more than bringing those things back would have. A long silence. You're grieving, he said. You're not thinking clearly. I want you to understand that Dennis said this to me on the day of my husband's funeral, on the day I buried Walter, with Walter's armchair in a truck somewhere between my house and Dennis's. You're grieving. You're not thinking clearly. I am thinking, I said, with complete clarity. I hung up. Simone arrived 12 minutes later. She walked through the door and she looked at the empty corner and she looked at the bedroom and she looked at the garage and she stood in the garage for a long time looking at the empty space where the workbench had been and she did not say anything at all. Then she came back inside and she sat across from me at the kitchen table and she said, Mama, what do you need? I need an attorney, I said. Today. Simone nodded. She pulled out her phone. She called 3 people in the following hour. Not attorneys. People who knew attorneys. Simone is a social worker by profession, and she has, in the course of her work, built a network of people across every professional category who can be reached on short notice and who respond when she calls, because she is the kind of person other people respond to. The third call produced a name. Marcus Webb, an estate and probate attorney in Birmingham who had been practicing for 30 years and whose assistant, when Simone called at 4:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, said that Mr. Webb could see us the following morning at 8. 8 o'clock the following morning. I wrote it down. I looked at the empty corner. And I thought, Dennis Odom, you have known me for 34 years. You have underestimated me for 34 years. That ends tomorrow. Marcus Webb's office was on the 6th floor of a building in downtown Birmingham that had the specific worn dignity of a place that has been doing serious work since before serious work required glass and steel to announce itself. Dark wood, full bookshelves, or the kind of office that belongs to a man who has been practicing long enough that his reputation does not need his office to do any additional work on its behalf. He was waiting for us when we arrived at 8, 61 years old, silver at the temples, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead in the manner of a man who puts them there when he is paying full attention and does not want anything between him and what he is looking at. He stood when we came in, shook my hand, shook Simone's, gestured to the chairs across from his desk, and sat back down with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has a full day and intends to use every minute of it well. Tell me what happened, he said. Not, I'm sorry for your loss. Not, this must be such a difficult time. I want to be clear that I do not hold the absence of those phrases against Marcus Webb. I had been receiving condolences for 14 months, and I had another year of them ahead of me, and what I needed at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, the day after my husband's funeral, was not another expression of sympathy. I needed someone to tell me what I could do. I told him what happened. All of it. The funeral, the cemetery, Paulette's call, the drive home, the front door closed on the emptied rooms, the armchair and the workbench and the woodworking books and the hand planes and the watch. Dennis's phone call, composed and prepared. Odom things. Walter would have wanted. The will can be contested. Rodriguez's report. The 48-hour ultimatum I had issued and that had now been running for 19 hours with no response. Marcus listened without writing anything down. I noticed that. The attorneys in this story who do not write while you talk are the ones who are using the listening itself as the primary instrument, who are building the shape of the thing in their head rather than on paper because the paper comes later and the listening cannot be reconstructed. When I finished, he looked at me for a moment. "Do you have the will?" he said. I had brought it. I had brought everything. The will, the deed, the police report from Rodriguez, the photos I had taken of every empty space in the house before I went to bed the previous night. I had walked through every room with my phone, and I had photographed the empty corner and the bare workbench space and the gap in the bookshelf and the small wooden dish on the dresser, and I had uploaded them all to a folder that I had emailed to myself and to Simone, and that I had printed that morning at the office supply store 2 blocks from Marcus's building. I slid the folder across his desk. He opened it. He looked at the will first. Walter's will had been drafted in March of the previous year, 3 months after the diagnosis, at a point when the prognosis was uncertain enough that Walter had decided not to wait for certainty before putting his affairs in order. It had been prepared by an attorney named Christine Holloway, notarized, witnessed by 2 people who were not family members, and stored in a fireproof box in our bedroom closet where I had known it was and where I had gone to retrieve it the previous evening after Simone left. Marcus read it in full. I watched him read. The will was clear. Walter had been, as I have told you, an organized man. The will reflected that. It did not deal in vague language or general gestures. It named things. It named the watch specifically. The 1974 Omega Seamaster, described by make and year, and the name of Walter's father from whom it had come, left to Simone with a specific sentence about its history and meaning that had made Christine Holloway set down her pen. It named the tools. The hand planes by category, if not individually. The tool chest. The woodworking equipment generally, with the specific instruction that these items were to remain in the family home for Loretta's use or disposition, at her discretion. It named the workbench, not as a bequest to anyone, as a fixture of the property. Walter had described the workbench as attached to the premises in his understanding of the term, which was a legal judgment call that Marcus paused on and made a note about. The armchair was not named specifically, but the general instruction was clear. Household contents not specifically bequeathed were to pass to the surviving spouse, which was me, which meant the armchair regardless of whether Walter had written its dimensions into the document. The books were household contents. Everything Dennis had taken was either specifically bequeathed to Simone, specifically designated for my use and disposition, or covered under the household contents provision. Nothing had been left to Dennis. Nothing had been left to any member of the Odom family, other than Simone. Marcus closed the will. He looked at me. "Mrs. Odom," he said, "I want to tell you where we stand." "Please," I said. "The will is clear, properly executed, and there is no obvious grounds for contest," he said. "The items removed from your property were taken without your consent, against the explicit provisions of the will, and through the unauthorized use of a key that should have been returned years ago." He paused. "The civil matter characterization the officer gave you is technically accurate. This is not a criminal matter in the traditional sense, because there was no forced entry and the individuals involved have constructed a familial claim they believe justifies their actions. But civil does not mean without remedy. It means the remedy is in a different court." "What remedy?" I said. "Replevin," he said. I looked at him. "It is a legal action for the recovery of specific personal property," he said. "You identify the items, you demonstrate your ownership, and you ask the court to order their return. It is not a damages claim. It is a return claim. You are not asking for money. You are asking for the things themselves." "Can we get the watch back?" Simone said. It was the first thing she had said since we sat down. Marcus looked at her. "The watch is the strongest individual item," he said. "It is specifically named in the will, bequeathed to you specifically, and its removal was in direct contravention of a properly executed legal document. If Dennis Odom has that watch, a court can order him to return it." Simone nodded. One nod. Precise. The nod of a woman who has her answer and is moving to the next question. "What about the will contest?" I said. He said it could be contested. Marcus looked at me steadily. "It can be contested," he said. "Any will can be contested. The question is whether a contest has merit and whether a court is likely to entertain it." He leaned back slightly. "The grounds for contesting a will are specific. Lack of testamentary capacity, meaning Walter did not understand what he was signing, or undue influence, meaning someone pressured him into signing it. Fraud. Forgery." He paused. "Walter signed this will 3 months after his diagnosis, in the presence of an attorney and 2 independent witnesses, in language that is specific, coherent, and entirely consistent with a man in full possession of his faculties, making deliberate decisions about his estate. The contest would go nowhere." "Then why did he say it?" I said. Marcus looked at me for a moment. "Because he wanted you to be afraid of it," he said. "Because a threat does not have to be viable to be effective if the person receiving it does not know it is not viable." I sat with that. Dennis had said the will can be contested knowing, or at least hoping, that I did not know enough about estate law to immediately understand that his specific will, executed under his specific circumstances, was about as contestable as the law of gravity. He had deployed a threat he knew he could not follow through on, because he had counted on me not knowing that. He had underestimated me. 34 years of underestimating me. "I want to file the Replevin action," I said, "for everything. Every item that was removed." Marcus nodded. "I also want to address the key," I said. He looked at me. "The spare key to my house," I said. "Dennis Odom has had a key to my house for 9 years. I want that key back, and I want it documented that he has no right to access this property." "We can address that in the filing," Marcus said. "And I would strongly recommend you change your locks today regardless." "I changed them last night," I said. Marcus looked at me over his reading glasses. "Last night," he said. "Simone called a locksmith from my driveway," I said. Something moved across Marcus's face, not quite a smile. The expression of a man who has just fully understood who he is working with and who has recalibrated his expectations accordingly. He opened his notepad. "Let's build the filing," he said. We were in that office for 2 hours. Marcus walked us through every element of the Replevin action. The documentation required for each item, the standard of proof, the timeline, what Dennis could do in response, and what the likely outcomes of each response were. He was thorough in the way of a man who believes his clients should understand their own case. He also told us something I had not expected. "There is a second avenue," he said, near the end of the 2 hours, "beyond the Replevin, or it is more aggressive, and it is optional, but I want you to know it exists." "Tell me," I said. "Conversion," he said. "A civil claim for the wrongful taking of personal property. Unlike Replevin, which seeks the return of the items, conversion seeks damages, the monetary value of what was taken, including in cases where the items have been damaged, sold, or cannot be returned." He paused. "If Dennis Odom has sold any of these items, or if the watch cannot be recovered in its original condition, conversion gives you a path to recover the value rather than the item itself." I thought about the watch. The 1974 Omega Seamaster, Walter's father's watch. The watch Walter wore the day of his diagnosis and the day we married and at Simone's graduation and at every Christmas. "And if they've sold it?" Simone said. "Then we pursue conversion," I said. Simone looked at me. "Then we pursue conversion," she confirmed. Marcus made a note. We left his office at 10:15 with a plan that had 2 tracks, a timeline that had the replevin filing going out within the week, and the specific purposeful feeling of people who have walked into a situation with nothing but anger and walked out of it with a strategy. Simone held the elevator door for me. We rode down in silence. In the lobby, she looked at me and she said, "Daddy would have hated all of this." "Yes," I said. "He hated conflict." "He did," I said. We walked out into the Birmingham morning, warm for September. "But he also," Simone said, "really loved that watch." "He did," I said. So, I said. We got in the car. Marcus filed the replevin action on a Friday, 4 days after the funeral. And I want you to hold that timeline because I think it matters. Because the speed of it was deliberate, and because deliberate speed was the only response proportionate to what Dennis had done. He had not waited. He had not given me 48 hours to grieve before deciding that the Tuesday of my husband's funeral was the right moment to send a truck. He had planned, and he had acted, and he had counted on the particular paralysis of grief to buy him enough time to establish possession of things he had decided were his. I did not give him that time. 4 days. Marcus filed on Friday morning and called me at noon to confirm. "It's in," he said. "Good," I said. "Dennis will be served within the week," he said. "Once he's served, he has 30 days to respond. His options are to return the items voluntarily, to contest the action, or to do nothing, which I would not recommend from his perspective, but which some people choose because they cannot bring themselves to take the situation seriously until a court date is in front of them." "Which do you think he'll do?" I said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I think he'll retain an attorney," he said. "He made a threat about contesting the will. That tells me he has been thinking about this legally for some time. A man who has been thinking about it legally will respond legally." "Then we'll see his attorney," I said. "We will," Marcus said. He was right. Dennis was served on a Tuesday, 1 week exactly after the funeral, which was a coincidence of timing that I noted and that felt, in the specific way that small symmetries feel when you are in the middle of something large, like the universe underlining a point. He retained an attorney 4 days after service. Her name was Pamela Gaines. I know her name because Marcus told me, and because I looked her up the same afternoon he told me. Pamela Gaines was a general civil practice attorney in Tuscaloosa. 20 years in practice. A website with professional photographs and a list of practice areas that included family law and estate disputes and general civil litigation. Not a specialist. Not an estate and probate attorney with 30 years of specific experience in exactly this category of case. A general practitioner. The response to the replevin filing came on a Thursday. Marcus called me that afternoon. "I have their response," he said. "What does it say?" I said. "So it says that the items removed from the property were family heirlooms to which Dennis Odom and other members of the Odom family have a legitimate claim based on the item's origin within the Odom family prior to Walter Odom's marriage." A pause. "And it says that the removal was undertaken with the knowledge and consent of the deceased." I sat very still. "With the knowledge and consent of the deceased," I said. "Yes," Marcus said. "Walter has been dead for 11 days, I said. "I know," Marcus said. "They are claiming that Walter, while he was alive, told Dennis he could come to the house after the funeral and take those things." "That is the claim," Marcus said. I thought about Walter. I thought about the man who had sat at his workbench for 20 years and built things with his hands and who had written a will with specific language about his tools remaining in the family home. I thought about the man who had worn his father's watch at every significant moment of our shared life, and who had dictated a sentence to Christine Holloway about that watch's meaning that had made the attorney set down her pen. Walter told Dennis to take his tools. Walter told Dennis to take his father's watch. Walter, who left the watch to Simone in a legally executed will signed months before his death. "Marcus," I said, "what do we do with that?" "We do what we always do with a claim that contradicts a documented legal instrument," he said. "We point to the document. Walter's intentions are not a matter of memory or interpretation. They are a matter of record. The will was signed, witnessed, notarized, and filed. The claim that Walter made a separate verbal arrangement that contradicts the will is not only legally insufficient, it is the kind of claim that tends to reflect poorly on the person making it when a judge looks at the full picture. Courts have a dim view, Marcus said, of people who claim the deceased told them something that happens to directly contradict what the deceased wrote down with an attorney. I thought about Dennis composing that claim, sitting across from Pamela Gaines in her Tuscaloosa office, constructing the story that Walter had said, Walter had told me, Walter wanted the family to have those things. Building it carefully, presenting it to his attorney as the truth, and signing his name to a legal document that stated it. Walter told Dennis, Walter who left Simone the watch, Walter who left me everything else. There's something else, Marcus said. His tone had changed slightly. Tell me, I said. I had my assistant do some research this week, he said, on the items in question. Standard due diligence for a replevin action, establishing current location and condition of the property wherever possible. And, I said, a pause. The watch has been listed, he said. I did not say anything. On an online resale platform, Marcus said. An auction site. The listing went up 6 days ago, 3 days after Dennis was served. 6 days ago, 3 days after he was served with the replevin action. Dennis had received legal notice that I was pursuing the return of the watch, and he had listed it for sale. How much? I said. The listing price is $4,200, Marcus said. I looked at the small wooden dish on Walter's dresser, the empty dish. He listed it after he was served, I said. Yes, Marcus said. He knew we were coming for it and he listed it anyway. Yes, Marcus said. I thought about that, about the specific quality of a man who receives legal notice that his sister-in-law is pursuing the return of his dead brother's watch. The watch specifically named in the will, specifically bequeathed to his niece, and who responds to that notice by putting it up for sale online. Not hiding it, listing it publicly. As though the legal notice was an inconvenience rather than a warning. As though he still did not believe, after the police report and the attorney filing and the formal service of process, that Loretta Odom was going to follow through, 34 years of underestimating me. Marcus, I said, does this change anything legally? Yes, he said, significantly. The listing of the watch after service of the replevin action constitutes an attempt to transfer the disputed property while the matter is before the court. It gives us grounds to request an emergency injunction to prevent the sale. Do it, I said. I was hoping you'd say that, Marcus said. He filed the injunction request that afternoon. Marcus called me the following morning. The injunction was granted, he said. How fast? I said. Yesterday afternoon, he said. The judge looked at the timeline, the listing appearing 3 days after service, and granted it without a hearing. The listing was taken down the same day, and I know this because Simone had been monitoring it. She had found the listing herself, independently of Marcus's research, 2 days before Marcus told me about it. She had not told me immediately. She had told me that evening, after Marcus's call, because she had been waiting to see if Marcus had found it first, and because she had not wanted to bring it to me without a plan attached. She told me over the phone. I heard the specific quality of her voice. The controlled, measured anger of a 31-year-old woman who had spent the week since her father's funeral watching her mother navigate what her father's family had done, and who had reached, in the process, the end of whatever reserve of generosity she had previously maintained toward the Odom family. He listed Daddy's watch, she said. I know, I said. After he was served. I know. Mama. I know, Simone. A pause. Are we going to get it back? She said. And I heard underneath the controlled anger the other thing, the thing that was not legal strategy or righteous fury but simpler and more painful than either of those. The voice of a woman who wanted her father's watch. Not as a legal victory. Not as a point scored in a fight with her uncle. as the object her father had worn on the day she graduated and at every Christmas, and that he had thought carefully about and left to her specifically, with a sentence about its meaning that had made the attorney set down her pen. She wanted her father's watch. Yes, I said. I said it with the full weight of everything I had done in the 11 days since the funeral. The police report, and Marcus Webb, and the replevin filing, and the injunction, and the 34 years of being underestimated by a family that had made a significant miscalculation about who Loretta Odom was when her husband was alive, and an even more significant one about who she was without him. Yes, I said, we are going to get it back. I meant every word. The hearing was set for November, 6 weeks after the funeral. 6 weeks that had the specific, compressed quality of time that is simultaneously too short and too long. Too short because I was still in the early, disorienting work of grief, still waking up reaching for a person who was not there, still setting 2 cups out for coffee by reflex and then standing at the counter with one of them. And too long because the hearing was the thing I was moving toward, and the moving toward it was the thing that was keeping me organized. Grief needs a direction. That is something nobody tells you. People tell you to take it one day at a time and to be gentle with yourself and to let the feelings come, all of which is true and none of which addresses the specific problem of a woman whose entire life has been organized around another person and who wakes up on the first morning of his absence and does not know which way to face. Grief needs a direction. The hearing gave me one. I used the 6 weeks. Marcus and I met 3 times in that period, not socially, working meetings. Each one with an agenda and a set of decisions to be made, and a set of actions that followed from the decisions. We refined the documentation. We organized the evidence into the clearest possible sequence. We prepared for every version of what Pamela Gaines might bring and determined how to address each one. The verbal consent claim was the one we spent the most time on. Because it was the most dangerous, not legally, Marcus had been clear about that. The legal weight of a properly executed will against an uncorroborated verbal claim was not a close contest, but dangerous in a different way. Dangerous because a courtroom is not only a legal space, but a human one. And humans respond to narrative, and Dennis had a narrative. The grieving brother, the family heirlooms, had the things that should stay Odom, that had an emotional coherence even in the absence of legal merit. We needed to dismantle it completely. Marcus had subpoenaed Christine Holloway, Walter's attorney, the woman who had sat across from Walter in March of the previous year, and taken down his wishes in the specific careful language of an estate attorney who understands that the document she is drafting is going to outlive the person dictating it and who treats that responsibility accordingly. Christine Holloway was 54 years old, practiced estate law in Birmingham, and arrived at the courtroom on the day of the hearing with the contained professional composure of a person who has testified before and who understands that her role is to be a precise and credible witness rather than an advocate. She sat in the gallery with Marcus's associate until she was called. I sat at the defendant's table. Dennis sat at the plaintiff's table. I had not seen him since the graveside service, since he had stood at Walter's grave and hugged me and then driven to a hardware store parking lot and rented a truck. He looked, sitting across the courtroom, like a man who had convinced himself that he was the wronged party in the room. The specific, indignant posture of a person who has decided that the audacity of being challenged constitutes its own injustice. His arms were crossed, his jaw was set. He did not look at me. Pamela Gaines sat beside him. Professional, prepared, the focused manner of an attorney who understands she is working with a difficult case and who has decided that the best available strategy is to present her client's position with as much dignity as it can support. The judge was the Honourable Calvin Marsh, 64 years old, 31 years on the bench, the kind of face that has absorbed a great deal of human foolishness over 3 decades and that has arrived through the long practice of having to rule on it, at a particular quality of patience that is not warmth exactly, but is not its absence either. The patience of a man who has seen most things and who is prepared to see whatever this is. He looked at both tables. He looked at the filing. "This is a replevin action," he said, for the recovery of personal property removed from the plaintiff's residence on September the 10th. He paused. The property includes a 1974 Omega Seamaster watch, a quantity of woodworking tools, a workbench, a quantity of books, and one upholstered armchair. Another pause. The defendant claims title to these items on the basis of family origin and an alleged verbal arrangement with the decedent. He looked up. "Let's hear it." Pamela Gaines opened. She was measured, and she was organised, and she presented Dennis's case in the most favourable light available to her, which was the best that could be said about it. The Odom family heirlooms. The item's origin within the family prior to Walter's marriage. The long-standing understanding within the family about the disposition of family property. And then, carefully, you with the specific care of an attorney who knows she is walking onto unstable ground and is trying to move across it without falling through. The verbal arrangement, Walter had told Dennis, in the months before his death, in the conversations that brothers have when one of them is dying and the practical matters of what comes after, are present in every room. Walter had told Dennis that the tools, the workbench, the watch, that these things should stay with the family, that Dennis should come and collect them. Pamela presented this clearly and professionally. And then Marcus stood up. He had 3 questions for the opening phase, and he had told me in advance what they were and in what order he intended to deploy them. And I had watched him prepare the sequencing with the focused attention of a man who understands that the order of information is as important as the information itself, that you build toward the most devastating point rather than leading with it, because a point that lands at the end of a prepared sequence hits differently than the same point delivered cold. The first question was about the will. He entered the will into evidence. Christine Holloway's notarized, witnessed, properly executed document, dated March of the previous year. He walked through it item by item, the watch, the tools, the household contents provision, with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who wants the judge to have time to read every word. Judge Marsh read every word. The second question was about the timing. Marcus introduced the evidence of the watch listing. Screenshots timestamp the listing appearing 3 days after Dennis received service of the replevin action. The price. The description, vintage timepiece from a private collection, read into the record with the specific quiet emphasis of a man who wants the room to understand what those words mean in this context. Judge Marsh looked at the timestamp. He looked at the date of service. He made a note. The third question was Christine Holloway. Marcus called her to the stand. She walked up with the composed efficiency of a professional witness and sat down and stated her name and her practice and her role in the preparation of Walter's will. And then Marcus asked her one question. One question. "Ms. Holloway," he said, "in the course of preparing Mr. Odom's will, did Mr. Odom at any point indicate to you that he had made or intended to make a separate verbal arrangement with his brother Dennis Odom regarding the disposition of any of the items named in this filing?" Christine Holloway looked at him. "No," she said. "Did he indicate any intention to exclude his brother from the will's provisions?" "His brother was not named in the will in any capacity," she said. "That was Mr. Odom's explicit decision." "And the watch," Marcus said. "The 1974 Omega Seamaster. Do you recall the circumstances of that bequest?" Christine Holloway paused. Not the pause of a person uncertain about the answer. The pause of a person deciding how to say something that has weight. "Mr. Odom was specific about the watch," she said. "He described its history in detail. He told me who it had belonged to and on what occasions he had worn it and why he wanted his daughter to have it." Another pause. "He was very clear." "In your professional assessment," Marcus said, "did Mr. Odom's instructions regarding the watch reflect the decisions of a man who had also made a separate arrangement to give that watch to someone else? Pamela Gaines objected. Judge Marsh looked at her. "I'll allow it," he said. "The witness can answer from her direct professional experience of the client." Christine Holloway looked at Marcus. "No," she said. "In my professional assessment, and in my personal experience of that conversation, Mr. Odom's instructions reflected the decisions of a man who knew exactly what he wanted and had given the matter serious thought." A pause. "Why, he was not a man who was uncertain about his own intentions." Marcus thanked her. He sat down. Pamela Gaines cross-examined Christine Holloway for 11 minutes. She was thorough and she tried several angles. The possibility that Walter had made arrangements after the will was drafted. The question of whether verbal arrangements could supplement written ones. The general principle that family understandings sometimes operate outside formal documentation. Christine Holloway answered every question with the same composed precision. She had no knowledge of any subsequent arrangement. She could not speak to what Walter may have said in private conversations. What she could speak to was what Walter had told her, in her office, with a pen in her hand and a document in front of her. And what Walter had told her was written down. Pamela Gaines sat down. Dennis testified. "I want to tell you about Dennis on the stand because I think it is important, and because I promised you accuracy, and accuracy requires acknowledging that Dennis, in person, in a courtroom, under oath, was not a cartoon. He was a 63-year-old man who had lost his brother 6 weeks earlier, and who believed, genuinely believed, I think, in the way that people can genuinely believe things that are entirely self-serving, that what he had done was right, that Walter would have wanted it, that the family claim was real. He said Walter told him. He said it clearly, and he said it with the specific conviction of a man who has told the story to himself enough times that it has acquired the texture of memory. He said it in direct contradiction of a notarized legal document. He said it after listing the watch for sale online 3 days after being served. Judge Marsh listened. He listened the way Judge Marsh listened to everything. With the patient, absorptive attention of a man who has been doing this for 31 years and who is building his understanding of the situation from every available source simultaneously. And then he asked Dennis one question. One question. He leaned forward slightly and he looked at Dennis and he said, "Mr. Odom, your brother executed a will with an attorney 8 months before his death. That will specifically addresses the items you removed from your sister-in-law's home. It leaves the watch to his daughter. It designates the tools for his wife's use. It makes no mention of any arrangement with you." A pause. "You are telling me that your brother made a separate, verbal arrangement with you that directly contradicts what he wrote down with a lawyer?" Dennis looked at the judge. "That's what he told me," Dennis said. Judge Marsh looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" the judge said. "Would a man who is organized enough to execute a detailed will with specific language about specific items also make a verbal arrangement that contradicts that will and tell nobody about it?" Dennis opened his mouth. He closed it. He said, "I don't know why he did it that way. I just know what he told me." Judge Marsh looked at his notes. He looked at the will. He looked at the timestamp on the watch listing. He ruled from the bench. Return of all items. Every item named in the Replevin filing. The armchair, the woodworking books, the hand planes, the tool chest, the workbench, and the watch. The watch specifically. Judge Marsh spent 3 sentences on the watch. He said that the watch was specifically bequeathed in a valid legal instrument to Simone Odom. He said that the attempt to sell the watch after service of the Replevin action demonstrated a concerning disregard for the legal process. And he said that the watch was to be returned within 10 days in the condition in which it was removed. 10 days. Dennis paid Marcus's fees. I want to give that its own line. Dennis Odom paid Marcus Webb's fees. I called Simone from the courthouse steps. She answered before the first ring had finished. "Mama," she said. "We won," I said. The silence that followed was the silence of a woman receiving news she had believed was coming, and that still, in the receiving of it, undoes her slightly. "All of it?" she said. "All of it," I said. "Everything. The watch. The tools. The workbench. Everything." I heard her exhale, long and slow. The exhale of 31 years of being Walter's daughter and 6 weeks of being Walter's daughter without Walter, and the specific accumulated weight of a fight she had entered the moment she drove to Birchwood Lane and stood in the garage looking at the empty space where the workbench had been. "When?" she said. 10 days, I said. "I'll be there," she said. The return took place on a Saturday, 9 days after the ruling. Dennis did not come himself. He sent Corey and a different truck, a hired moving company this time, with actual paperwork, and 2 men who were professional and efficient, and who carried everything back into the house, with the focused impersonality of people doing a job rather than people making a statement. The armchair went back to its corner. The woodworking books went back to the shelf, not quite in the right order but present, all 12 of them, which I verified by counting before I signed the receipt. The tool chest went back to the garage, the hand planes inside it, all 7. I checked each drawer. The workbench required the 2 moving men and Simone and a neighbour from down the street who heard what was happening and came over without being asked. It went back into the garage in the space it had occupied for 21 years, and when it was in place I looked at the side and Walter's penciled measurements were still there. The marks of a man who used his bench as a record, his handwriting in pencil, present and legible and exactly where he had left it. I stood in the garage for a long time. Simone found me there. Dorothy stood beside me and we looked at the workbench together and neither of us said anything for a while. Then she held out her hand. The watch was in her palm. I had not seen it leave Corey's hands. She had been in the front room when the final box was brought in, and she had opened it herself, and she had come to find me in the garage, with the watch in her hand and her father's workbench in front of us, and the September light coming through the garage window at the angle Walter had always liked. I looked at it. 1974. Omega Seamaster. The watch Walter's father had received for 30 years of service. The watch Walter had worn the day of his diagnosis, and the day we married and at every Christmas. Simone fastened it around her wrist. She held it up. We looked at it together, and I thought about Walter, checking on his tomatoes, unchoosing the house on Birchwood Lane, sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of scrap wood and a book on joinery, learning a thing he was going to love for the rest of his life, dictating a sentence to Christine Holloway about a watch that made the attorney set down her pen. He had known exactly what he wanted. He had written it down, and Dennis Odom had underestimated for the last time the woman Walter Odom had chosen to spend 34 years with. Walter's armchair is back in its corner. I want to start there because that is where I start every morning now. I come downstairs and I look at the corner, and the chair is there, and I make 2 cups of coffee by reflex, and then I remember, and I drink one of them standing at the window looking at the garden, and I talk to Walter the way I have been talking to him since September, which is out loud and without embarrassment, and with the specific one-sided intimacy of a woman who spent 34 years saying everything to a man and has not yet found a reason to stop. He would have had opinions about the hearing. He would have sat in that armchair and listened to everything I told him, and he would have been quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was thinking rather than when he had nothing to say. And then he would have said something precise and a little dry and entirely correct, the way Walter always did, and I would have laughed, and the laugh would have hurt and been worth it. I know what he would have said about Dennis. He would have said, "Loretta, Dennis has always needed to believe he was owed something. And I have spent my whole life not correcting that belief because correcting it would have cost more than managing it. And I am sorry that the cost of my management became your problem." That is what Walter would have said. I know it because I knew him. 34 years of knowing someone is an education that no other institution offers. You learn the architecture of a person, Not just the rooms they show you, but the load-bearing walls, the places where the structure is strongest and the places where it has been repaired, and what it was repaired with and whether the repair held. I knew Walter's architecture completely. I knew where Dennis fit in it, and I knew what it had cost Walter to manage that fit for 63 years, and I know, in the way of a woman who loved him without reservation, that he would have been sorry for what his management left behind. He doesn't have to be sorry. I handled it. I want to say something to Dennis directly. Dennis, you stood at your brother's grave and you hugged me and you drove to a hardware store parking lot and rented a truck. You took his armchair and his tools and his books and his father's watch. You told a judge that Walter gave you permission and you listed the watch for sale 3 days after you were served, and you paid Marcus Webb's fees, and you sent Corey with a hired truck 9 days later to bring everything back. I want you to understand something. I did not do this for me. I did this for Walter. For the man who wrote down what he wanted with a lawyer because he was organized enough to understand that the people who loved him were going to have to live in the aftermath of his death, and who wanted to make that as clear as he could. I did it because Walter was specific about the watch, and specific about the tools, and specific about what should stay in the house, and I was not going to let his specificity be undone by a truck and a spare key and 34 years of your certainty that Loretta Odom was the thing standing between you and what you believed was yours. I was never the thing standing between you and anything. Walter chose his life. He chose it every day for 34 years. And he wrote it down. To everyone who is still watching, tell me where you are right now. City, state, country, whatever part of the world has this story in it today. Drop it in the comments with the time. I read every one. And before you go, I need you to do one thing. Think about who has a spare key to your house. Right now, not later. Think about every person who has ever been given a key to your home and whether you know with certainty that the key has been returned or accounted for. Think about what that key represents. Not just access to your space, but access to your life, to the objects that hold your history, to the corner where someone's armchair sits. Know who has your keys. If you are not sure, change your locks. I changed mine the night of the funeral. Best decision I made that week. If this story found something in you, if any part of it sat with you in the way that true things sit, share it. For the woman in your life who is about to hand a spare key to someone who has already decided what they plan to do with it, help me find her before the truck does. And subscribe, because I have more stories and every one of them is true and every one of them belongs to a woman who knew exactly what she was owed and who went and got it. I am Loretta. Walter's chair is in its corner. His watch is on his daughter's wrist. And every morning I stand at the kitchen window with my coffee and I look at his garden and I talk to him and I think about how well he knew me. Well enough to write it down.